In 1983, DC Comics acquired characters from the dying publication company Charlton Comics. A short time later, Alan Moore pitched a maxi series, using the recently bought characters in a comic intended to explore the idea of what if superheroes existed in the actual world, with the answer not being as positive as you may think. DC accepted this pitch, but told them to create original characters for story instead. The Charlton characters were used as a basis for the characters that would become comic book icons later on. These characters were all very different, complicated, and damaged, which made the maxi series feel real and interesting. Alan Moore, artist Dave Gibbons, and severely underrated colorist John Higgins formed a trio like no other, whose combined talents resulted in one of the greatest comic books of all time. Watchmen's first issue hit stands on September of 1986, and the medium of comic books was never the same again. I'm sure you've heard this story countless times, but what's so fascinating is that you find yourself here, watching this video from just an average comic book channel, about a comic book you've probably known for years. But I guess that's just the reaction to seeing one of the comics that made us. My name is Joshua C, and welcome to the Comics That Made Us, the show where I talk about why a certain comic is amazing and its impact on the comic book industry. Today we are going to delve into a comic book that everyone still talks about, Watchmen. Watchmen is one of the most critically acclaimed comic books of all time, and despite its age, it continues to sell like hotcakes every month. It did so many things differently that it pretty much shocked everyone who read it at the time, including the editors over at DC Comics. Watchmen is famously known as the comic that popularized the anti-hero, and is popular for its darker tone, world, and characters. But the thing is, Watchmen is more than just an edgy comic featuring darker protagonists. There are a ton of comics that predate Watchmen that could fit into the same description that many define Watchmen as. There's the first Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles run, the underappreciated Camelot 3000, and Alan Moore's own Miracle Man series that I haven't read yet, but is one of the biggest examples of superhero stories getting more complex and dark. Watchmen might be famous for its dark take on the superhero genre, and rightfully so, but it's more than that. I don't think the editors over at DC were shocked at the fact that there were dark superheroes and mature themes in Watchmen. I think it was because of how weird and different this comic is compared to normal comic books in almost every way. It was the really odd choices, from the secondary color scheme in the graphic novel to convey the corruption of the world, to the cover being a close-up of the first panel of the issue instead of one of the popular characters in the title doing a cool superhero pose, that I think made this comic special. The comic used a simple 9-panel grid for almost the entire book, had a comic within it where its story was slowly unraveled throughout the book, and featured a lot of superheroes with traits that were unorthodox and unusual. These are only a few of the multitude of unique decisions that the creators made when making Watchmen. The first issue alone had a script of over 100 pages. It is a miracle that this maxi series even got published. There is so much care and thought put into each character, panel, and line of dialogue. If I had to describe Watchmen in one word, it would be deep. The odd choices have meaning behind them, and improve the reading experience, instead of them being gimmicks to show others that they're unique, but actually make the comic book's quality much worse. This comic has so much stuff that it does differently and well that it just puts me in awe. What's so cool about Watchmen is that it does so many things right, and as a result, many people can take away different things from it. If I covered everything that Watchmen does right, this video will take a little bit too long. Heck, we still have to talk about Watchmen's impact on the comic book industry. So what I'm gonna do is, I'm gonna tell you guys what I enjoyed specifically from my recent rereading of the comic for this video, so that this video would have a personal spin on it. But anyway, let's start. One thing I appreciated that I want to talk about first is the coloring in this comic. John Higgins is really underrated when it comes to talking about the people that contributed to the success of Watchmen. There are occasions in the comic where two scenes play out at the same time, and because of the coloring, I know which one is which. These pages are especially pretty and create this satisfying pattern that looks like a game of tic-tac-toe that would make people with OCD elated. The coloring choices are really smart as well. The secondary colors make the city look twisted and, in a way, poisoned, which creates a very uncomfortable and creepy atmosphere. It's a physical representation of how bleak and corrupt the world of Watchmen is, and I absolutely adore that stylistic choice for the colors of the city. While other evil places are usually filled with dark and drab colors, the cities in Watchmen are filled with vibrant colors that give off a distinctly creepy vibe. The coloring isn't just good because of the clarity between scenes and locations, coupled with the unique choices made for these cityscapes and environments in the comic, but it's also really clever and can sometimes have a narrative of its own. In chapter 6 of the book, Dr. Malcolm interviews Rorschach, who, by the way, is kind of crazy and very cynical. At the beginning of the issue, Dr. Malcolm is positive about the situation, which is backed up by the yellow backdrop behind him. And as we all know, yellow is a symbol for happiness. But as the issue starts to progress and Dr. Malcolm gets slowly influenced by Rorschach's philosophy, traumatic childhood, and depressing view of the world, Malcolm's backgrounds begin to slowly change, representing his gradual realization that this was a hopeless case and that the world is vain and lonely. From the color yellow in the beginning, the backdrop turned to the color green and orange, and the issue's final panel was simply black. Using color to tell a story is something that I really appreciated when reading Watchmen, and even though Alan Moore probably made a lot of the decisions pertaining to the coloring in most of the book, John Higgins perfected what Moore gave him. I didn't just appreciate the coloring in Watchmen though, I also appreciated Dave Gibbons' contribution to the project. The scripts for these issues were multiple times longer than the actual page count of the comic, which is kind of insane. If I was Dave Gibbons, having to take in every single minute detail in the script and having to translate all that info onto the page as accurately as possible, I would be totally stressed out. Yet, Dave and John were able to adapt Alan's lengthy scripts perfectly. Moving on, I absolutely adore this comic book's composition. As I've stated earlier, this comic book used the 9-panel grid. Through this panel layout, a lot of information and events could play out because the physical space of each panel was tiny. A common complaint that I get from people who are trying to get into comic books is that they find it confusing to read. They don't know which panels to read first. Sure, we all know that we read comic books left to right and top to bottom just like normal English books. But sometimes panel layouts can be very confusing and can possibly overwhelm the reader, especially readers who are new to the medium of comic books. Watchmen fixes this dilemma through its simplicity. It might be a plain layout, but Watchmen did it with style. and through it, many non-comic book readers can enjoy the pages of Watchmen with ease. It is known as the comic book that even people who don't read a lot of comics have read at some point, and that is due to how good it is, but it's also because of its layout that was easy to comprehend for most people. There is so much going on in Watchmen. It is a murder mystery, a twisted look at what superheroes would be if they existed in real life, a science fiction story, an analysis on people with different philosophies, and so much more. Again, as I said earlier, there is a comic within this comic, and even though bits of it constantly play out throughout the entire story, it doesn't feel like a chore to read, or an interruption to the plot of the comic. The comic dives severely deep into the history and past of the characters and world, and it's one of the things that I love about this comic. The book does this through showing a lot of flashbacks to the past and such, but also through the last 3 to 4 pages of every issue except the final one. After each issue is over, there's a set of 3 to 4 pages of pure text. These might sound boring in the beginning, but they are absolute gold. They ground Watchmen's characters and world, making them feel real and lived in. Honestly though, these 2 pages of extremely interesting and informative text are really some of the best things about Watchmen in my opinion. Reading the first 4 chapters of Hollis Mason's book put me in awe. This stuff did not need to be here, and honestly can get overlooked by people like me, but it's in here because of Alan Moore's effort and desire to flesh out the world of Watchmen. Whatever newspaper or book the passage comes from, you can feel the passion Alan had in writing them. The last thing that I personally love about Watchmen is how well defined all of the characters are. Each main character in Watchmen stands out, not just because of their outer appearance, but the way they act based on their beliefs and guiding principles. They are all pretty weird superheroes, and honestly, you need to be at least a little crazy to even encourage the idea of dressing up in a costume and fighting crime. I love how each of the characters' extreme personality influences a lot about them. Rorschach, whose black and white philosophy is injected and seen in his costume, speaks in phrases and broken sentences, which is indicative of his tragic past and unstable mental state. Dr. Manhattan, whose powers allow him to see all of these small details that make up the world around him, as well as view time in a non-linear way, result in his speech being very complex and absolutely hilarious to us readers sometimes. He literally does not know how to talk like a normal human being anymore, and it's depressing and funny at the same time. He just bluntly states the future to some people, and it makes for the funniest scenes in the entire comic book. John, what are you saying? That you know the future about everything? About us? In 1959, I could hear you shouting here. Now, in 1963, soon we make love. Just like that? Like I'm a puppet? John, you know how everything in this world fits together except people. Your prediction is way off, mister. Anyway, back to the topic, I really like all the characters in the world of Watchmen. There are a bunch of writers that make everyone talk in the same way, especially when it comes to the guest appearances, where their dialogue and actions only reflect what the writer needs them to say for the given plot. But Alan Moore's characters act in a way that is always justified given their personality and previous actions, and that solidifies them and makes them memorable characters to us. The characters are so well defined and weird, and that's why it's fun to analyze them all. Because of how different each character acts, Given their exaggerated personality, it's not only easy to distinguish them from the pack, but it was also simple for Alan Moore to decide what each character did given the situation at hand. There is so much that this comic did right, and I am absolutely happy with the success that Watchmen got. It was well deserved. It was a comic that perfectly showed off the power of the medium, had flawed and complex characters, and was made by a bunch of people with such love, detail, and passion for the medium of comics. It's truly a timeless masterpiece, being unique in every one of its aspects. What's also unique about this comic, though, is how it impacted the comic book industry. There is no doubt that this is one of the most important comic books of all time. This comic, along with Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, are known as the comics that initiated what comic book historians view as the modern age of comics. This age, which still extends to today, is known as when comics became more adult-oriented. I believe that Watchmen has had an overall positive impact on the comic book industry. Even people outside of comics adore it. It was one of the comics that showed that the medium could be as complex, compelling, and special as film, novels, and television. Almost every comic creator has drawn inspiration from Watchmen at some point. With all that said, it's kind of weird that everyone pretends that Watchmen was the time that comics got dark, even though, as I mentioned earlier, comics have gone dark numerous times before this. Also, I find it weird that some people thought Watchmen was good because it was mature and dark. That is just not the case. One of, if not my favorite Spider-Man stories of all time is the 3-issue arc that Stan Lee and Steve Ditko made from 1965 to 1966 called If This Be My Destiny. It is pure gold, and it's not gruesome or dark in any way. What made Stan Lee and Steve Ditko's Spider-Man run work was how relatable Peter Parker was. The reason Watchmen succeeded was because it was an excellent comic that didn't try to copy what everyone else was doing, but instead created something very original and new. The protagonists were good, not because they were edgy and dark. They were memorable because they had unique personalities that stood out, and we somehow empathized and were attached to them despite most of them being kind of crazy and morally questionable. My point is, Watchmen's success wasn't the result of the story and characters being edgy. Its success came from the fact that it was simply a good story. But the folks in the industry didn't get that, did they? It's common practice that when something becomes popular, others copy aspects of it to try and replicate the success that the popular piece of media garnered. There is nothing that is truly original, and that is okay. Although taking inspiration from a piece of media is almost always good, it can also ruin a creation. Everyone wanted to replicate Watchmen's success, and they did this by making their comic books dark. In the age that soon followed, especially in the 90s, edginess was a staple of comic books, whether that dark tone benefited or damaged the story. I love that Watchmen allowed for more mature stories and runs, and allowed comics to tackle more serious issues. But there is no doubt that some bad came out of it. Runs like Sandman were amazing, but some of Image's stuff, while successful at the time, didn't really age too well. Watchmen was a creative comic that did things differently, and it had substance, but a lot of the comic books that tried to replicate its success ended up being a very shallow experience to read, and for some reason, they sold well. This was because in the 90s, people saw old comics start to rise in price. As a result, people went crazy and tried to invest their money by buying comic books. Grittiness and trend chasing, coupled with a speculator boom, saw comic books becoming more mainstream, which was a good thing at the time, but later resulted in the industry's collapse. It wasn't fully the fault of Watchmen that comics turned out the way they were, with Marvel going bankrupt, and the generally gimmick-filled and gritty comics that were in the 90s, but there is no doubt that Watchmen played a part in it. I'm sorry if I sound harsh. I love Watchmen, but we gotta admit that the people who tried to replicate its success didn't get why it worked in the first place. It's kind of funny how Watchmen impacted the comic book industry, because it wasn't really all that positive. It was more of a mixed bag. The graphic novel's impact changed comics forever, and it even holds up well today. What came of its success, though, most of which Alan Moore didn't like, wasn't the book's fault, but was the industry's. The bad stuff that happened because of Watchmen's success was the fault of us readers and creators. The creators that took the dark tone of Watchmen and tried to put it into their own stories without knowing that it actually damaged the comic book, especially with characters known for their positivity and hope, were weirdly backed by us. Comic books that had style but no substance were put on the spotlight. Why did we do this? I have no idea. There were a ton of good comics like Bone, Preacher, Marvels, The Invisibles, and more, but for every one of these, there are like 10 bad titles. In summary, Watchmen led to a weird and mixed era of comics. But it's our fault that all of this happened. The gimmicks and comics with style but no substance were widespread because people bought into them. But despite all the bad that followed, which again wasn't entirely Watchmen's fault, it made people outside of comics treat the medium in a more serious way in regard to the potential of what a comic book could be. And because of that, I will always treasure the impact of Watchmen. But anyway, what did we learn from this overly long video about why Watchmen worked and its two-sided impact on the comic book industry? Well, we must learn to get the right message from a piece of art. Watchmen illustrated how comic books could be as sophisticated as any other medium. But most of all, it inspired us to think out of the box and experiment with elements in a comic, whether they be major or minor. The irony is that this comic full of original ideas led to an era of creators copying each other and an emphasis on sexy art over deep storytelling. But it's a good thing that a few people learned from it and actually created some really cool stuff. So yeah, we need to understand why a comic works on a fundamental level. A comic book can have a good theme, lesson, and subject, but if the story isn't executed well and it doesn't convey the subject matter in an intriguing way, then the ideas or lessons the creator is pushing are not going to reach or impact the reader in any way. We should also think about whether taking an aspect of a piece of art and incorporating it into ours is actually going to enhance our work and not ruin what has been well established in the piece of art we took from. I feel like superhero comics were not really that good for a period of time because they relied on copying each other, which only nullified the quality of the stories told. It might have become special if the comics weren't taking popular tropes and putting it into their comics. Anyway, looking at why Watchmen worked and its impact on the comic book industry has been fascinating, and I hope we learn the lessons that I just talked about. Watchmen is a masterpiece that affected the comic book industry in more aspects than any other comic ever did since its release. And I think that's a good thing, even though its popularity led to mixed results. The fact that many people are still talking about it 35 years later after its initial release shows the book's timelessness, quality, and depth. Watchmen is still relevant, even getting a new miniseries recently. Because of the book's magnificence, I believe that as long as comics are relevant, Watchmen will continue to flourish and be a must-read for all comic fans out there. After this lengthy video, it's more than safe to say that this comic was truly a comic that made us. Anyway, thank you guys for watching this video. Also, thank you for 200 subs right at the end of the year. That was like my goal set in mind, and we literally hit it at the deadline. Also, despite me not uploading in a while, we've grown. Like, the channel has grown. So I want to thank all of you newcomers and the people who have constantly stayed throughout my videos, of course, for watching and supporting me. I appreciate everyone out there who likes my videos and is subscribed to my channel, because that triggers dopamine in my brain, and that's a good thing. Also, sorry for not releasing a video in a while, since last September. There was supposed to be a video on why I love the Hitman series, the current series of Hitman games, back in November, but like, I recorded all the footage, I made a super long script, and I even recorded myself in a tuxedo, or a suit, with a red tie that I bought online just for the video. But while I was editing, the whole, my hard drive died out on me, and all of the files were gone. So yeah, I was kind of emotionally destroyed until December. So yeah, it took a while for me to make another one because hard drive failure. But hopefully that doesn't happen this year, because I am going to be back. Hopefully I can make videos every month, or at least one video every month like I did last year, until again my computer died on me. Yeah, but thank you all for watching. I will see you in the next comic book video. That's not how I end this stuff. My name is Josh C, and I will see you in the next comic book video.